What is it you spent the last couple of decades of your life doing, understanding, studying, and sharing with the world?
I started out as somebody who was fascinated by the Soviet Union. I went there when it still existed as a student. I was lucky enough to watch it fall apart. I was a journalist based in Warsaw at the time the Warsaw Pact came to an end. Then I spent some years writing history books, trying to explain how control was maintained over such a large space by so few people. But all that time, I thought that what I was doing was writing stories about the distant past. I was analyzing a system that didn't exist anymore. What's happened to me in the last decade is that I've discovered that a lot of what I thought was over and done and belonged to some other era has come back. Most people think democracies end with a coup d'etat or, tanks in the street or somebody shooting up the presidential palace. But actually, in the modern world, they mostly end because someone who is legitimately elected begins to take apart the system and take away the things that ensure free elections can continue. And I started watching that happen in multiple countries at the same time. And I saw this authoritarian instinct started to come back. And that's what I write about now.
Are these just election cycles? Or is there something bigger at play here? Because, I spend a lot of time reading articles from decades ago or hundreds of years ago. And in all times in history, it seems that there were problems. But it seems that the democratic system has a remarkable way every 4 years of clearing out what people weren't happy with and putting something new in. Is this time different to the past?
What feels different to me is for the first time in several established democracies, most notably the United States, but not only, you have political parties who come to power with the explicit idea that they will alter the system in order to make sure that they can stay in forever. The pioneer of this idea was Viktor Orban in Hungary. He was elected legitimately with a big margin, and then what he did was slowly seek to capture the state. So what a democracy needs in order to survive, in order to maintain its stability, it needs a few neutral institutions. It needs independent courts. It needs an independent electoral commission. It needs independent media. In the modern world, it needs a meritocratic bureaucracy. So people are hired and fired to measure pollution or worry about traffic and road construction who aren't cousins of the ruling party. They aren't somebody's friend, but they're actual experts who understand how to do things. So you need those things to be in place in order to ensure that each time there's an electoral cycle, it's a fair election. And you see people who are elected who once they had power, decided to take those institutions apart. If you think about democracy, it's actually a very strange system, right? So you win an election, and in a democracy, you have to preserve the rules so that 4 years from now, your bitter enemies can contest you and maybe beat you again. You lose an election, you have to say, okay, we're allowing our rivals to stay in power, but we trust that the system will remain fair. So 4 years from now, we can also contest them again. So it requires a certain level of agreement about the nature of the system. And when that begins to break down, then you begin to have imbalances, and then you begin to have elections that seem unfair to people, and then you begin to have a completely different kind of national conversation. And we can see that has happened in several places, and of course, most notably in the United States. And because the United States is the largest democracy, because it's played the role of leader of the democratic world, the influence of America on other countries is pretty profound. And so this idea that democracies can possibly break down is suddenly both horrifying people, but also interesting to other people who say, all right, if you can do it in America, you can do it here.
There's a part of me that just thinks, that could never happen in America. And that's obviously a bias that I have, being 33 years old and not knowing a ton about history. But I'm sure there's lots of people that think this is some sort of theoretical idea, but it would never happen in America because we would never allow America to not be a democracy. We wouldn't allow a Russia situation where you've got Putin sitting in power for 2 decades or whatever.
Sure, but there are systems in between Russia and liberal democracy. You can have democracies that aren't fair. And actually, I'm afraid to tell you that in the United States, there is a history of that. So in the American South, before the civil rights movement, you very often had, in effect, in the southern states, you had these one-party states where, the rules were pretty rigged. Everybody knew who was going to win. Not everybody was allowed to vote. So black people weren't allowed to vote, or it was very heavily restricted. It was hard for them to vote. And that existed in the United States, between the Civil War and the 1960s. You had very undemocratic parts of the United States. And I think some of the people who are in Washington right now in the Trump administration are working from that history and from that historical memory.
What is your biggest concern in this regard?
Well, I have two concerns. One is that inside the United States, the deterioration of American democracy, it's already happening, right? So it's already creating a class of people who no longer feel they have a stake in the political system and who won't vote, may never vote, and will be outside of politics and outside of the national conversation. That can lead in the direction of violence, that can lead in all kinds of negative directions. We see the development of new kinds of paramilitary in the United States that we never had before, the development of ICE. We've never before had a single national police force wearing combat uniforms, wearing masks, not subject to the normal restrictions of local police forces. We also have a rise in high-end corruption. The president, people around him, companies close to him seem to have access to ways to make money and are making money out of doing politics in a way that was also not possible at that scale in America before. And that's sort of one whole set of concerns if you want to go down one of those roads.
There's this map in front of us on the table. I realize some people can't see because they're listening, but there's a map on the table in front of us. Could you just explain what this map shows and why it's significant?
The map shows the level of democracy around the world. And of course, the thing that's immediately notable to me is that those who made the map don't count the United States anymore as a liberal democracy. So a liberal democracy meaning a state where, as I said, the electoral rules are clear, where the electoral system is set up not to favor one party or the next. And instead, it's described as an electoral democracy, which is somewhat less free. You see similar systems in South America. In Europe, you mostly still have liberal democracies. In Australia, Japan, South Korea, you still have liberal democracies. And then most of the rest of the world are some form of autocracy, either very closed and very repressive like China or like Russia, or they are in a democratic gray zone. So there are states that could really go in either direction. They're still open. But it's true that if you'd looked at a map like this a decade ago or 2 decades ago, it would have been a lot bluer, the blue being democracy and the red or reddish being autocracy. So you do see an absolute process of democratic decline that's been written about by many people over the last few years. I believe very much that states influence one another. People follow and imitate and copy their neighbors.
Do you think it's possible that in our lifetimes, the US might become an autocratic country?
So the U.S. could become what I think on this map is described as an autocratic gray zone. So you could imagine the U.S. as, in effect, a one-party state. So a state where one political party has control and the other just can't win national elections. You already have this system of, we call it gerrymandering, where electoral districts are being written in such a way as to favor one party or another. The effect of that also is that once you have people who don't really have to contest elections anymore, then you have corruption. Because if you're going to win anyway, why do you have to worry about your constituents? Then you have worse government and worse services. Because if you don't have to have an electoral contest, then you can pursue your own interests. You can do favors for businessmen who help you in other ways. And we see this decline of democracy already at the state level. And of course, there could be a danger at the national level of a fixed system that made sure only one party ever wins. And then you would get all these pathologies that we already have at the state level. And we're beginning to have them even now. And remember, we have right now a president who refused to accept the result of an election in 2020. And who staged what was intended to be an electoral coup. It failed. But, the idea that he wouldn't do it again, or nobody would ever dare to do that, or nobody would block an election, I think it's pretty naive at this point. It happened already. And so, of course, it can happen again.
Do you think he's going to try and get a third term in office?
I don't think so, because I don't think he wants one. But I think it's possible that people around him will try to shape and affect the elections in a way that makes sure that a Republican wins.
Or maybe his children?
It's very possible that one of his children will run for president.
Because there's a way to kind of control power in America, you know, when they talk about MAGA, which is, I guess, a collection of people now. You know, you could say J.D. Vance is part of MAGA and the kids and Trump. So maybe they'd want to keep it within MAGA. Maybe that's the...
They might, or they might want to keep it within the family. I mean, look, what is MAGA now? You know, what is different about Trump's second term from Trump's first term? So one of the things that happened after January the 6th, after the attack on the Congress, was that many of the people who'd been around Trump, Republicans, people who do foreign policy, people who do domestic policy, left. They said, right, this is too much for us. You know, we're American patriots. You know, we can't support this kind of attack on our political system. And they departed his presence. But exactly that moment, that attack on the electoral system attracted other people. So for different reasons, people who disliked the American political system, who don't like democracy, don't like liberal democracy, thought it was leading America in a left-wing direction. Some of them have political reasons. They were attracted to Donald Trump because they said, right, this is somebody who has the nerve to try and overthrow the system, and we like that. And they're not all the same. They have different views. So there's a tech authoritarian group who want influence over the American political system because it's good for their businesses and because they don't get the point of democracy anyway, and they think they should be in charge. There's a kind of Christian nationalist group who think the United States should not be a secular state, it should be a Christian state, and they are interested in taking over the system with that end. And then there's a traditional MAGA group who think the United States should be run by the people who used to run it, you know, kind of white Christian people of a certain kind, and they want to bring the United States back in that direction. So there are different views. And they don't all agree with each other, but they do agree that the system requires radical change. And that's the difference between the first and second term. So Trump's first term, I think he has never cared much one way or the other for American democracy. He personally sees himself as someone who should be allowed to act in any way he wants. He doesn't like any kind of constraint. He admires foreign leaders who have no constraints. But he was one way or another constrained in his first term by the system. And now he's surrounded himself by people who are seeking to help him avoid those constraints. And that's new.
I think when we have these conversations, we assume that everybody agrees that democracy is the better path.
Sure. And
that they understand the downsides of an autocracy.
So there are different kinds of autocracies, to be clear, and some are more repressive than others. The main thing that you would notice, the first thing that you would notice, would be the absence of the rule of law. Rule of law means that judges and courts and the legal system make decisions based on the Constitution or on the laws. And in an autocracy, you have rule by law. And that means that the law is what the person in power says it is. Mm-hmm. And so if you did a program, for example, and someone on your program said something that was offensive to the leader of the country, you could be arrested and you could be put on trial. And instead of the court saying, right, we've looked at this case, and according to the law, in the law it says we have freedom of speech and you can do whatever you want, somebody could ring up from.
Iran has figured out that we can't beat them. We're not weakening Iran. We have strengthened Iran, and we can't stop their drone attacks. And what you're seeing is far more chaotic decision-making is happening in the White House than is happening in the government of Iran. And it's evidence Trump is losing power.
So when I look through the response to the last conversation, the audience had lots of different types of questions. Like there's 90-odd million people stuck right in the heart of this that often don't really have a voice. What do you think happens next for them? And what is Israel's role in this?
Well, Israel's playing two roles here that have not helped us correctly assess the situation. And we'll talk about that.
And then what do you think happens with Europe?
NATO is, for all practical purposes, dead.
And what happens next?
So for 21 years, I laid out what a hypothetical bombing campaign of Iran would look like. And when I was here last time, every single thing we talked about unfolded in the first several weeks of the war.
So when you did this 21 years of modeling these attacks, how did America come out of this situation?
So there was a consistent set of findings, and America can bomb them, attack them. We could even threaten to murder all 92 million of them. But the bottom line is,
the Kremlin or from the White House or from, whatever is the leadership of your country, and say, no, actually, we want this guy in jail, and we don't care what the courts think. And that's the big difference. Here, I'll tell you a real story that happened in Hungary when Hungary was going down the road in the direction of a one-party state. You can be the CEO of a company, and people can come and knock on your door, and they can say, we would like you to sell us a majority share in your company. And you say, no, why should I let you do that? My company, I built it, I invested in it, I don't want to sell it. And then, okay, so what happens the next day? Somebody breaks the windows of your house. A few days later, your children are harassed on the way to school. People who work for you start having legal problems. This or that, some kind of mortgage issue or and suddenly your company encounters regulatory issues. There's a tax inspection. And one by one, the state finds a way to harass you, to harass your company, your workers, so that eventually you say, okay, I give up, I sell, and I'm leaving the country. And this happened to somebody I know.
Sounds like Anthropic in the United States recently, where Anthropic, the AI company, refused to give the United States access to its AI under certain conditions. And then very quickly, Pete Hegseth did a post, I think, and Donald Trump did a post basically saying that they were going to restrict their ability to work with the government.
We aren't used to the idea that the government decides which companies thrive and which ones die. So once you have an autocratic state that can do what it wants legally, then it can decide which companies succeed. It can base government contracts, which are very important in every country, not on who's the best company or not on some kind of blind procurement process, but on who's your friend. Or who's donated to your political party, or who's, in the case of the United States, who's invested in your company. So one of the things that we have in the United States for the first time ever, I think, is a president who is actively doing business in countries and in areas that are of interest to the people he's doing business with. So, for example, the Trump family does business in Saudi Arabia. It has a deal with a Saudi company called Dar Al Khan, which is a sort of development company, and that company has close relations to the Saudi leadership. The Saudi leadership is interested in deals with the United States, political arrangements with the United States, and the money is going into the Trump family coffers in order to make a better arrangement for the country of Saudi Arabia. So it's a way in which, because we have a declining democracy and because we have an increasingly kleptocratic system, decisions are being made by the President of the United States, by the White House, not based on what's good for Americans, but on what's good for his company. And that if you look at Russia, that's exactly how the political system works there. If you look at China, China's more complicated. It's a bigger country. It's more sophisticated. But even there, you have, again, decisions made not for the welfare of the Chinese people, but for the ruling party, for the Communist Party.
And we have two jars of money here. This was Trump's net worth when he went into office, $2.3 billion, reportedly. And this is his net worth now, just 2 years later. $6.5 billion. Looks like being a president is a profitable job.
So that has never happened before. This is completely new in American history. There have been presidents there have been whiffs of corruption around them. There's been, presidential relatives who've tried to trade off the president's name, but we've never had a president running businesses while in office. And as I said, in such a way that the people with whom he's doing business are hoping to benefit politically. or in other ways. And that's completely brand new. And if you just back to your original question, which is why is democracy better? Churchill was the person who said that democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. So it's a multi reasons why it's flawed. Democracies require an immense amount of tolerance. There's always a lot of cacophony. There's a constant flux and change that people find enervating. But at the very least, what democracies can do is they can force issues like this into the public sphere. You're allowed, at least in a democracy, to question whether decisions are being made on the basis that they're good for everybody or they're being made for the benefit of the president.
I guess supporters would say, Trump's not running the businesses himself. It's just his kids' activity that is generating this net worth.
Yeah, but everybody knows that they're his kids. And you wouldn't do it. Why did the Saudi government invest $2 billion in Jared Kushner's fund? It wasn't because they just like Jared Kushner. It was because Kushner is Trump's son-in-law. And now, of course, Kushner is the Trump administration's negotiator in the Middle East. So he's negotiating with his business partners. The appearance of conflict of interest is overwhelming. And as I said, we've never had in American history, or I think in recent British history, we've never had that kind of conflict of interest so clear at that high a level.
Do you spend much time thinking about what's going on in the Middle East, the wars in Iran and Venezuela, and the bigger picture here of what's happening and how this might link back to what you were saying about authoritarian regimes? It's all very confusing. I feel like we went through a period of relative peace through the Biden era. And Trump obviously ran on this promise that he wasn't going to start new wars. And we seem to be having a lot of wars. Russia and Ukraine still raging on, doesn't seem to be nearer to any conclusion. And now there's this war in Iran that threatens to be a never-ending war. Well, why? What's going on?
There are several things going on. One of them is that in declining democracies and historically in autocracies is you have leaders who conduct wars as a way of consolidating their base and consolidating their support. And so one of the things that Trump likes to do is if he declares a war, I believe he had a different expectation of the Iran war. He's using foreign policy. He's using these fighting of wars in order to consolidate his support at home. So that's a part of what's happening. But some of this has nothing to do with Trump. We are now living in a world where the historical political system, the one that was built after 1945, some people call it the liberal world order. I don't really like that term because it sounds kind of mushy. But the order that has existed since 1945, the one that was somewhat based on the UN, that was based on a set of rules and treaties, that order has begun to break down.
I think the greatest brand destruction over the last 18 months is the U.S. brand abroad in AI. So with America, Trump has been convinced that this was his defining moment to be known as the president that liberated the Middle East. But I think the Trump administration will be known for criminal corruption and incompetence, and that incompetence is bubbling up. And then the second greatest fall is AI, and also Sam Altman, who's gone to the dark side. And I'm an AI optimist. But here's what we fail to understand with these tech CEOs. They do not have our best interests at heart.
Scott, I often come to you to help myself form my opinions on some of the most sort of consequential issues going on in the world. And when I look at some of the quotes from the CEOs of these AI companies, I've got one here from Elon that says, AI and robots will replace all jobs. What's your view here?
I think it's mostly bullshit. The catastrophizing is nothing more than thinly veiled attempt to say my technology is so devastating that it's going to shift society and you should invest at this crazy valuation. And the data doesn't reflect that there's some big exogenous meteor coming for the employment market. But I believe it's actually going to create more jobs than it destroys. But the scary thing for me is that because of AI and because of these frictionless relationships that people are engaging in online, I think a lot of young people are losing the ability to endure rejection. But I think a more important technology in terms of how it's going to change the world and what will create more shareholder value is not AI. It's
really.
And it's breaking down for several reasons. One, we've started to discuss already, which is changes inside the United States, and the United States was a really important pillar of that order. But it's also breaking down because the autocratic powers, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela until recently, and others, have been challenging that order for a while themselves. They didn't like the American dominance of of international politics and the conversation. They were competing with America at a strategic level, but also in what is really a war of ideas. So let's go back to autocracy and democracy. If you are the leader of Russia or you're the leader of China, what is the thing that is most threatening to you? And the answer is the language of liberal democracy. So all this stuff that we find boring and we're used to, and this idea of freedom of speech and separation of powers and rule of law, all those things that we have come to take for granted in our societies are a huge challenge to the political system in Russia or China. What is Putin most afraid of? He's most afraid of a street revolution of the kind we had in Ukraine in 2014. So when people are standing on the street and they have signs saying, we're against corruption, we want democracy, we want to be in the European Union, we want to be integrated with Europe, he's afraid of that happening in Russia. Because if you live in an autocratic state where you don't have freedom of speech, where there is no justice, where the government decides what all the rules are, then those ideas are explosive and exciting, the same way they were in the 18th century when they first appeared in the Declaration of Independence. And people can be motivated by them, people will go into the street for them, people will risk their lives for them. And the autocrats know that. And so really for the past decade, since 2013, 2014, you see them seeking to spread those ideas, to promote them. I mean, we all know now about Russian propaganda campaigns. We know what Russian disinformation looks like. There's a Chinese version too, which we don't see that much in English, but it appears in other countries. We see them seeking to undermine democracy, trying to spread the influence of a different set of ideas. So the war in Ukraine is exactly that war. The Russians are firstly trying to destroy Ukraine as a nation. They want it to disappear. They're an empire. They want Ukraine to be their colony. And they understood perfectly well that by challenging Ukraine, by invading Ukraine, they were defying this liberal world order. They were defying the rules of post-war Europe. Because in post-war Europe, there was a decision made after 1945, we're not going to invade each other anymore, we're not going to have wars, instead we're going to decide everything by diplomacy. Borders will not be changed by force. And the Russians understood that they were breaking that norm, and they invaded Ukraine. They also invaded Ukraine because the Ukrainians were using that language, that powerful democratic language that we take for granted. And Putin said, if they can do it in Ukraine, then people could do it in Russia. And so I need to crush this Ukrainian democracy movement. And so that war really is a fault line between the democratic world and the autocratic world. So I think what you're seeing is the breakdown of an older system that was more or less organized around by American rules.
Through history, which lasts longer? Democracy or autocracy?
Oh, autocracies.
They last longer?
Well, look, if you look back in history, most human societies in most times have been what we would now call autocracy, but they were whatever. They were monarchies. They were led by tribal leaders, by warlords. There have been very, very few liberal democracies, and most of them have not lasted. And I should also say the people who wrote the American Constitution knew that. And when they wrote it, they were reading the history of ancient Rome. There was a Roman Republic, and it fell when it was taken over by Julius Caesar. So they all knew that story. They were reading about the Greek democracies, Athens, which also fell. And when they wrote the U.S. Constitution, they were thinking, how do we make this last? What can we put in it to make it last? It's a longer story, whether you think they were successful or not. But everybody who created democracies, whether it was after World War II in Europe, whether it was America in the 18th century, everybody understood that this was a fragile system, and they tried to put checks and balances, judicial, legislative, and executive power. They tried to create systems that would ward off the impulse towards autocracy.
I don't know if you have the answer to this question, but where are people happier on average? In a democracy or in an autocracy? So
I have to tell you, I know a little bit about happiness surveys, and over and over again, the happiest place in the world is Finland. Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway. Scandinavia is very happy. The reasons for that may not be anything to do with the nature of the political system. It might have other sources, but the happiness is certainly connected to democracy. It's connected to stability. And of course,
you said you're a middle-aged man that hasn't gotten over the loss of his mother. Is there a way to?
I don't want to. I think the receipts for love is grief. I hope my boys feel the same way about me. Hasn't gotten in the way of my life. It makes me be more bold with my emotions. I used to see it as a problem. I went to grief counseling. Now I see it as not a bug, but as a feature. And so what I would tell every young person is I hope they have a lot of joy in their life. I also hope they have a decent amount of grief, because that means they have people they love immensely. You can never tell your parents how much you love them too much. Forgive them. And my mom died slowly, which is bad for her, but it was good for me because nothing went unsaid. I miss my mom terribly. I'm a middle-aged man who hasn't gotten over the death of his mother. Bye to my life. Raised me on her own, secretary's salary, gave me confidence. Everything.
Connected to wealth.
Just looking at some research here, it says, while wealth and economic stability are critical for happiness, regardless of the government type, democracy provides additional structural benefits like participation, security, and lower corruption that tend to lift a society's overall life satisfaction.
Well, democracies, by definition, are, at least in theory, the state is structured in a way to benefit everybody, right? At least that's how it's supposed to work. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a national healthcare system or whether it's a system of roads and railroads, the state is building things that are designed to serve everybody. In an autocracy, that doesn't necessarily happen. So in Russia, ordinary Russians have no influence on that decision. They have no way of expressing their views. They can't say what they think. They have no ability to influence the state. They can't say, well, actually, hey, we'd like to build a hospital instead of bombing another city in Ukraine. And so they have very little ability to change the system. And that of course, creates frustration and unhappiness.
If that is true, and this is why I asked the question, if it's better for the people, and at some degree, I think if informed people would choose it, which I think is, and I say the word informed because I understand in a lot of these countries where they don't have democracy, that I'm now using don't have democracy instead of having to say that word again, they limit the access to information so that people don't know what they're missing out on, I guess, or don't have those potentially disruptive ideas. They're not exposed to them on their phones or devices. I would think a person would choose to live in a democracy if given the choice and the information.
I would think so. Although, there are other, there's a deep human need for a sense of stability and security. And hierarchy for some people. And it's true that authoritarians seem to offer that. In a democracy, you do have this constant change of leaders. There's more demands on citizens. You have to participate. If you care about your country, it's not just enough to vote. You need to be involved in politics in some way. And autocracies, I think falsely offer stability. And so the argument of the Russian and Chinese governments, and the argument they make in those social media campaigns that they run inside the US or the UK or Europe, is exactly that. Authoritarianism is stability, safety, traditional values, hierarchy, and there are people for whom that's deeply appealing. So I wouldn't discount that instinct. And when people like that are also able to control information, when they control the security services, when they monopolize the use of violence, they can be very hard to undo, even if the majority of the country wants something different.
It's almost hard for me to understand how the people in Russia are okay with the fact that the leader has been there for several decades and isn't moving. It's hard for us to understand because in the UK or in America, there'll be people on the streets.
It doesn't matter what they think.
Really?
Well, because they have no way of expressing what they think. There's no such thing as public opinion or public debate. There's no forum you can join where you can say what you could express your views in a way that's fair. And if you do say, I think Putin should be, it's time for him to retire, you could be arrested. And so people begin to adjust what they think. And they begin to change their behavior because they know that it's dangerous to say things. This is a phenomenon I found in the work I did years ago in the Soviet Union. The propaganda said how successful we are and how much hay we've grown this year and how many bits of steel we've made, and it was always fake. And so the question was always, well, did people really believe that? Did people believe in the system? Did they believe in the propaganda? And the answer was a little weird. It was convenient for them to believe it. In other words, in order to get on in life, you had to believe it, or you had to say you believed it. And at a certain point, what they really thought, like deep in the back of their mind, didn't matter, because there was no way to say what you think. And that's what you have in Russia again now. It's, for me, very tragic, because there was a period in Russia in the 90s and 2000s when there was open debate and people were speaking freely and clearly about the state of the country. But right now, it's once again a situation where expressing your views is dangerous, and so people just don't do it. And they try to stay out of politics altogether. You know, politics is dangerous and ugly and nasty. Like, just stay home. And remember that this is something that's developed over years. It didn't happen from one day to the next. It was a decline that's been happening since the year 2000.
I've heard you say that there's 5 core tactics that autocratic leaders use to dismantle a democracy. Could you walk me through the 5 tactics and maybe also link them to things that are happening now in the West, which might be warning signs of the dismantling of one's democracy?
Well, corruption. We've done that one already. Mm-hmm. Corruption you have in any political system, and you often have it in democracies too. But in an autocratic society, you have more corruption because the legal system is controlled. And so what you have, for example, in the United States, the fact that Donald Trump has taken over our Department of Justice and has installed loyalists who are looking, among other things, for example, to prosecute his enemies just because they're his enemies. That means you have a check and balance. So normally, if there was high-level corruption in the White House or in the administration,
nobody has done the things they've done alone. You know? Like everyone, I've seen people tell these stories of climbing Mount Everest and my ascent and all those Sherpas that went with you. Let's talk about them. No one's climbing Everest alone. No one's discovering, the South Pole alone. No, you weren't. In fact, the person was the guy who just first navigated the South Pole was led there by somebody. You know what I mean? All these stories that we tell, self-made. Oh, I love that phrase. It's my favorite. Self-made billionaire. Oh, really? Oh, it's an interesting choice of words. So you just did this all by yourself. Huh? You made the thing by yourself with your hands. You made many more of them by yourself. You drove the trucks. You thought of all the ideas. You put it in the stores. You gave it to the people. You took the money. You invested it. You grew it all by yourself. All by yourself. All the ideas were from your head, all by yourself. And then you got there. Come on. There's no such thing. And I don't think it diminishes your achievements. I just think it's important because it helps people understand that they need other people to get to where they're trying to get to. And maybe sometimes the reason you're not experiencing that is because you're trying to do it alone. I hear people all the time go like, I'm gonna put my head down and I'm gonna crush it. Okay, alone? Good luck.
You would have people inside the Department of Justice and the FBI who would investigate it. But now we don't have that happening.
Is that different from the past?
It's different. It's different. I mean, we didn't have anybody try to use the White House to make money in this way before. So hard for me to say what would have happened in the Clinton administration. But we didn't have a completely politicized civil service, a completely politicized FBI who would avoid, any kind of investigation. And so corruption is a particular symptom of authoritarianism, and it's also a tool. It's something that the president can offer people. You get along with me, you don't criticize me, your business will prosper. You will get government contracts.
Is that what we're seeing with all these big tech CEOs that seem to be going frequently to the White House and saying wonderful things about him and his support and having dinner with him and none of them speaking out? But if you looked at their Twitter feeds a couple of years ago, they were all saying the most horrific things about Trump.
Yes, I mean, they've understood that if this is going to be an American administration, that you have to genuflect the president, you have to be sycophantic to the president in order to get business deals, then they'll do it. If you have to donate to his White House Reconstruction Fund, which many of them have done, then you'll do it. If you have to donate to his inauguration, you'll do it. It's a question of who is supposed to be the beneficiary of government regulation. It's supposed to be Americans. I mean, ordinary people, we're supposed to become more prosperous. The beneficiary is not supposed to be, as I said, the president and his family and his entourage. And that is a big shift in American politics.
When I look back at someone like the CEO of OpenAI's statements on Trump, if you go back to 2016, he said he was an unprecedented threat to America and called him a potential disaster for the American economy. He said he was irresponsible in the way dictators are and compared his rhetoric to the big lie, tactics used by historical authoritarians like Hitler. He described him as erratic, abusive, and prone to fits of rage. And then I see him side by side at the White House saying nice things about him and saying nothing critical at all.
It's one of the most bizarre things, actually, about this whole administration. You know, if I were that rich, like, what's the point of being rich if you can't say what you think? Mm-hmm. You know, I don't understand the value of it.
Can I hazard a guess as to why the incentive structure they're trapped in?
What's your guess?
I think that being rich for these people is actually just a proxy of status. And I think the thing that risks their status, which is what they care about more than anything else in the games that they're playing, is losing to their direct competition. And it's quite clear to me that if someone like Sam Altman was to say anything negative about Trump, it would of course hurt his business, but actually it would hurt something more, which is his status. He would lose to Anthropic and XAI and Gemini. To lose in your category of peers, which are all these sort of tech oligarchs who are in this category of peers, would hurt more than anything. I think it would hurt more than losing $1 gazillion. It's just like losing the game.
Yeah, although there are two things about it. One is it's very short-sighted, because ultimately, who will suffer if there's a decline in the American political system, in the American legal system? I mean, it's them.
Maybe they've gotten used to paying to play, in a way.
They have, but it's a mug's game. I mean, it's fine as long as you're one of the people who are winning. But what if the rules change?
Yeah, like in Russia with the oligarchs, Putin could
That's
decide.
right. I'm sick of these oligarchs. I want different oligarchs. And that happened in China too. So So that's one argument against it. The second argument is, and I think Anthropic might have figured this out already, and some of the law firms have figured it out, there's also a gain to be made by saying, no, I'm independent. We have our own corporate rules, we have our own legal code of ethics, and we're going to behave as patriotic Americans. And then you attract business. And they may be doing well with it. And as I said, there's a parallel thing that happened with U.S. law firms. There were some frivolous lawsuits, and they settled them. And then there were some who said, no, we won't settle, we won't do that. And the ones who didn't do it have all won, and they're all thriving. I mean, so there is also a benefit to be gained, both commercially and financially, and I would think even in that weird world of status, by standing up for what you believe in and by remembering the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is what happens to the United States. I mean, the United States is your main market. It's where your employees come from. It's the place where you're doing business. And if the United States begins to suffer, then you suffer too. And so thinking a little bit like that might help some of them.
Is this just another 3 years of this sort of, unusual behavior before we resume business as usual in our democracies?
I'm asked this by Europeans all the time, and my sense is that a lot of things will not ever be quite normal again, either inside the U.S. or around the world. I mean, I would advise, for example, if you're doing business with the U.S. or you're a security partner of the U.S., I would strongly recommend that you have Plan B. It's really time for NATO to have a plan in case the United States flakes out, to have a different security option. What happens to the U.S. after Trump isn't clear. First of all, the next president could be J.D. Vance, who I think is even more committed to the project of making America into a one-party state. Or the next president could be a Democrat we haven't heard of yet, who decides to use the broken system in order to take advantage of it in a different way. I hope that won't happen, but you can't count it out. Once the norms are broken and once the laws have changed, then it can be anybody can take advantage of it. If Trump can use the federal bureaucracy to threaten media companies, then why can't the next president? And so, certain things don't necessarily get fixed once they're broken.
On that point of global partners of the US now thinking about their own defense and themselves more, is that a pattern that you're seeing? Just from my observations of, we're sat here in London at the moment, but my observations of the UK used to consider ourselves to be the great alliance, sort of partner of America.
Special relation.
We had this special relationship, which I never knew what it meant, but I always liked it. It seems like that's gone out the window. And the UK are now speaking a lot to President Macron in France, and it seems like we're having our own little European meetings. But around the world, it seems that that's happening. Canada don't seem to be a great ally of the US anymore after they threatened to invade them. What is happening from that perspective? Are we becoming more individualistic and breaking into our own little groups because of Trump's rhetoric?
What you're watching is everybody all over the world hedging. Everybody is looking for alternatives. So you now have an EU-India trade agreement, which nobody would have bothered to do a few years ago. You have Canada initiating a security relationship with the EU. You have conversations inside NATO about realistically, if the United States weren't to help us in case of a Russian attack, what would we do? So those aren't really public conversations, but privately, lots of people are having them. Everywhere you go, you see these so-called middle powers. This is a term that Mark Carney of Canada first started using. Brazil, India, the EU countries, Japan. You see them beginning to make new relationships with one another. If the United States flakes out and we can't trade with them in a normal way anymore because the president changes the trading rules every 5 minutes, then at least we'll have a decent trading relationship with somebody else. I travel a lot. I've traveled a lot in the last 3 months, and everywhere I go, that's the main topic of conversation. Canada was completely integrated with the United States. It almost didn't have an independent economy. And now the Canadians are thinking, how do we benefit from our oil and gas wealth to protect our sovereignty? Who else do we do deals with? Carney's been to China. He's also talking to India. With whom will we potentially share nuclear technology? There are these conversations between France and Poland and France and Germany about a different kind of nuclear umbrella. It's all pretty tentative, but it's moved much faster than I would ever expected. I think the breaking point for a lot of people in Europe was Greenland. And I don't know if people have really focused on what exactly happened there, but you had the President of the United States saying he was going to invade Denmark. There we go. So the United States was saying it was going to invade Greenland. So Trump was kind of hinting it in public, and behind the scenes, there were other signs that maybe they were really preparing to do it. And so what did that mean in Denmark? That meant that the Danes said, okay, we're preparing for a US invasion. And this is a country that's very pro-American. Lots of big Danish companies in the United States, including the ones who create the weight loss drugs. Lots of Danish-American travel, friendship, everything, security relationship going back to the Second World War. Okay, the Americans are invading, what do? Do we blow up the airports in Greenland? And they did start planning that. Do we plan to shoot down American planes? Are we going to shoot at American soldiers? Are they going to shoot at us? And they had to suddenly imagine a real war with their closest ally and how that would